Romeo and Juliet. If they both survived. Chapter 1. The Plan That Worked. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny. You know the beginning. You know all of it, probably, better than you know the beginnings of your own family's quarrels. The Montagues and the Capulets, the old hatred whose origin no one living could quite remember. The servants brawling in the marketplace over an insult no one could name. And into this old poisoned garden 2 children born, one to each house, who would meet and love and die inside a single week, and by their dying end the feud that their living never could. That is the story you know. Let me tell you the one you do not. It ran the same, at first, exactly the same, beat for beat, as though the world were reading from the familiar script. There was the feast at the Capulet's house, the masked ball where Romeo, a Montague, came uninvited with his friends, sick with love for a girl named Rosaline who does not matter and never did, and saw across the crowded torchlit hall a girl he had never seen, and forgot Rosaline in the space of a heartbeat, forgot his own name, forgot the feud, forgot everything except that there was now in the world this one face. Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight. For I ne'er saw true beauty till this night. And Juliet, 14 years old, betrothed already by her father to the County Paris, a good match, a sensible match, saw the young stranger and felt the same lightning go through her. And they spoke, their first words to each other a shared sonnet, hands touching like palmers at a shrine, and they kissed before they knew each other's names, and then learned the names, and learned with the names that they were enemies, that the only face in the world belonged to the one house in the world forbidden to them. My only love sprung from my only hate. There was the balcony. Of course there was the balcony, the orchard at night, Romeo below in the shadows, Juliet above at her window not knowing he was there, speaking her heart aloud to the dark. O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name. And him answering out of the shadows, and the two of them, drunk on the night in each other, swearing love in the reckless total way that only the very young can swear it, and agreeing, that very night, hours after meeting, to marry. It was madness. It was the purest thing either of them would ever do. They were 14 and 17, and they had known each other for 3 hours, and they gave each other everything, held nothing back, staked their whole lives on a face seen once across a room. And this recklessness, this absolute unhedged all or nothing, is exactly what made it what it was, is the thing the whole world has envied and wept over ever since, because almost no one gets to love like that, without calculation, without reserve, without the 1,000 small hesitations that experience teaches. And the ones who do get to love like that mostly only get it because they are too young to know better, and mostly lose it precisely as they learn. There was Friar Lawrence, the kindly priest who married them in secret the next day, hoping foolishly, tenderly, that the union of these 2 children might heal the ancient wound of their houses. For this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. There was the disaster that followed hard upon. Tybalt, Juliet's hot cousin, killing Romeo's friend Mercutio in a brawl, and Romeo, mad with grief, killing Tybalt, and being banished from Verona on pain of death. There was the wedding night that was also the parting, one night together, the lark and the nightingale, dawn coming too soon, Romeo climbing down from Juliet's window into exile. And there was the final machinery of the tragedy set in motion. Juliet's father, knowing nothing of her secret marriage, ordering her to wed Paris in 3 days, and Juliet, desperate, going to Friar Lawrence, and the friar giving her the potion, the vial of liquor that would make her seem dead for 42 hours, so that she would be laid in the family tomb, and Romeo, secretly summoned, would come and carry her away to Mantua where he waited in exile, and they would live. And here is where the 2 stories part. Here is the hinge of everything. In the story you know, the plan fails, and fails for the smallest and most human of reasons. A letter goes astray. Friar Lawrence sends a messenger, Friar John, to Mantua to tell Romeo the whole plan, that Juliet is not truly dead, only sleeping, that he must come to the tomb and be there when she wakes. And Friar John, through sheer bad luck, is delayed, quarantined in a house suspected of plague, unable to leave, unable to deliver the letter, and the message never reaches Romeo. Instead, Romeo hears only the other news, the news that everyone in Verona believes, that Juliet is dead. And Romeo, not knowing it is a sleep and not a death, buys poison, rides to the tomb, finds his wife lying pale and still and to all appearance dead, and drinks the poison and dies beside her moments, only moments before she wakes. And she wakes and finds him dead, still warm, the cup still in his hand, and takes his dagger and follows him. 2 children dead in a tomb over a message that arrived too late. But in this telling, the message arrived. Friar John was not quarantined. He rode to Mantua unhindered, an ordinary journey on an ordinary road, and he found Romeo in his lodging and gave him the letter. And Romeo read it, read that Juliet lived, that the death was a feigned death, a sleep, that he must come to the tomb and be there at the waking. And Romeo wept with relief and joy, and did not buy poison, and rode to Verona not in despair but in hope, and came to the tomb, and waited in the dark among the dead, holding his sleeping wife, until the 42 hours were spent and her eyes opened, and she saw his living face above her. And they were both alive, and they laughed and wept in the tomb like 2 people given back the world. The plan worked, that is all. One letter arrived that in the other story went astray, and everything was different, and the 2 children who were meant to die in a tomb walked out of it instead, into the night, into the rest of their lives. And the rest of their lives is the story no one ever tells, because the rest of their lives is the thing the tragedy exists to spare them, and to spare us. And whether it was truly a sparing or something else is the whole of what I have to tell you. Chapter 2, Mantua. They did not go back to Verona. They could not. Romeo was banished on pain of death, and their marriage was a Montague-Capulet union that both houses would sooner see dead than blessed. So they fled first to Mantua, where Romeo had been in exile, and then, when Mantua felt too close, too full of Verona's reach, onward to a smaller town further off, where no one knew them, where a young couple could arrive with a little money and a false name and disappear into ordinary life. The false name was the first small death of the great romance, though neither of them felt it as such at the time. They could not be Montague and Capulet, those names were fire. Those names were the whole tragic glory of what they were, and so they became something plain, something forgettable, a young husband and wife from somewhere, no one in particular. Romeo took work. There was no more money coming from the great house of Montague, whose son was banished and presumed by many to be worse. He had never worked in his life. He was a gentleman's son, raised to leisure and love-longing and the elegant melancholy of the young and rich. And now he learned badly, slowly, with much wounded pride, to be useful, to earn, to come home tired with his hands rough. And it did not suit him, and he did not do it gracefully. And Juliet watched the boy who had climbed her orchard wall and spoken in perfect sonnets come home gray with fatigue and short of temper and smelling of other men's business. And she loved him still, but she began, without wanting to see him. That was the thing that neither of them had reckoned on in the tomb, in the joy of being alive, that they were going to see each other. In the 3 days of their love, the feast, the balcony, the wedding, the one night, they had never seen each other at all, not really. They had seen only the beloved, the transfigured other, the face that was the whole world, lit by torchlight and moonlight and the unbearable brightness of first love, which is a light that shows you everything you long to see and nothing that is actually there. 3 days is not long enough to see a person. 3 days is long enough only to fall, gloriously, into the idea of a person. And they had been going to die at the end of the 3 days, in the old story, still inside the idea, still transfigured, never having had the time to come down into the daylight and see the ordinary human being that the idea had been draped over. And now they had time. They had all the time in the world. And time, which the lovers of Verona always believe is their enemy, too swift, too soon, too rash, turned out to be a subtler enemy than they had ever imagined. Not the enemy that kills love in a night, but the far patient enemy that wears it down over years, grain by grain, until one morning you wake beside a stranger you have known for 20 years and cannot remember what the torchlight ever showed you. Juliet bore a child in the first year, and another in the third, and a third that died, and a fourth. Her body, which Romeo had worshipped in the language of shrines and saints and pilgrims, became a mother's body, tired, thickened, marked by the children. And she was not yet 20, and already she felt the girl on the balcony receding from her like a figure on a departing ship. Romeo loved the children. He was tender with them, tenderer than he was with much else. But the children took Juliet's nights and days, and turned the wife who had once been all fire and poetry into a woman perpetually exhausted, perpetually needed by small hands, with no time and no breath left over for the kind of love that requires leisure and moonlight and the freedom to be reckless. Their love had been born in a single sleepless night of stolen freedom. It had to survive now in a small house full of crying children, on too little money between two tired people, and it did survive. That is important. It did survive, but it survived the way a fire survives when you bank it down for the night. Still warm, still alive, but no longer the leaping blaze that had lit the whole orchard, only a low red glow under the ash, easy to mistake on a cold morning for a fire that has gone out. Chapter 3: The Quarrels. They quarreled. This, more than anything, would have astonished the lovers of the balcony, that Romeo and Juliet, of all the couples in the world, should quarrel, should raise their voices, should say cutting things and slam doors and lie back to back in the dark not speaking. But of course they quarreled. Everyone who lives together quarrels. The only lovers who never quarrel are the ones who die before they get the chance. And Romeo and Juliet had been, in the old story, exactly those lovers, and so had come down through the ages as the couple who never quarreled, the perfect ones, the flawless flame, precisely because they had never lived long enough to have a single ordinary fight. They quarreled about money, which they had never once mentioned in the orchard, and which now shaped every day. They quarreled about the children. They quarreled about Romeo's moods, his sudden black melancholies, which had seemed so poetic and Byronic in a 17-year-old gallant, and seemed only tiresome and self-indulgent in a grown man with a family to feed. They quarreled about the past. This was the worst kind, Juliet accusing Romeo, in the heat of some fight, of having been in love with Rosaline 3 hours before he ever saw her, of being a boy who fell in love with love, who would have sworn eternal devotion to any pretty face across any torchlit room. And Romeo, wounded to the quick because it was half true, striking back that Juliet had been betrothed to Paris and would have married him and been content if Romeo had never climbed the wall, that her great love was an accident of which wall got climbed first. Terrible things. True things, half-true things, the things long marriages learn to say, the things that go in like blades because they are aimed by someone who knows exactly where you are soft. And after the worst of these quarrels, lying awake, each of them would think the thought that neither ever spoke aloud, the thought that is the dark heart of this whole story: we should have died in the tomb. Not as a wish for death, neither of them wished to die. They were young and alive, and there were the children, but as a strange grief for a lost perfection. For they both understood dimly, without the words for it, that there had been a version of themselves, the version that had almost happened, the version that in some other telling did happen, who had died at the height of love, at the absolute peak of it, in each other's arms, transfigured, eternal before a single quarrel or a single unpaid bill, or a single morning of seeing each other tired and ordinary and afraid. That version of Romeo and Juliet was perfect and would be perfect forever, fixed at the summit, a flame that never guttered because it was snuffed at its brightest. And they, the living Romeo and Juliet, the ones who had walked out of the tomb, were the imperfect ones, the ones who had to go on, past the summit, down the long slope of an ordinary life, watching the perfect version of themselves recede further and further above them into legend, while they trudged on into the valley of the everyday. There is a particular pain in having been, briefly, a legend, and then having to go on living. Most people never touch the legendary at all. They live ordinary lives from beginning to end and never miss what they never had. But Romeo and Juliet had touched it, had lived for 3 days, the most perfect love story the world would ever tell, and then had been handed back their ordinary lives and told to make the best of them. And the ordinary life, which would have been a fine life, a good enough life for anyone else, was for them a perpetual falling off, a daily reminder of the height they had briefly stood at and would never stand at again. They were haunted, both of them, all their lives by their own younger selves, by the boy in the orchard and the girl at the window, who were braver and purer and more alive and more in love than the tired grown people they had become, and who would go on being braver and purer and more in love forever, because they had had the good fortune or the terrible fortune to be frozen at their best. Chapter 4: The Return of Paris. When Juliet was perhaps 30 and had been married to Romeo for 16 years, and had 4 living children in lines at the corners of her eyes and a body that had forgotten the balcony, the County Paris came back into her life. Not the man himself. He had married someone else, years ago in Verona, having mourned his dead betrothed a respectable while and then, being sensible, moved on. But the idea of Paris returned in the form of a merchant who came through their town, a prosperous, settled, kindly man of middle age, who took a courteous interest in Juliet, and who was everything that Romeo was not. Solvent, calm, even-tempered, untroubled by black moods or poetic despairs, a man who paid his bills and did not quarrel and looked at Juliet still, with a warm, steady admiration that her own husband, worn down by 16 years of daily life, had long since stopped being able to summon. Nothing happened. This is not that kind of story. Juliet was faithful and so was Romeo all their lives. The fidelity was never the question. But Juliet found herself for the first time, imagining the life she might have had if she had married Paris, the sensible match her father chose, the good, calm, prosperous man. Imagining a marriage without the great love, without the balcony, without the tomb, without any of the fire, but also without the poverty and the quarrels and the black moods and the grinding exhaustion and the perpetual falling off from a legend. A smaller life, a duller life. A life that would never have made anyone weep for 1,000 years, and a life that might, she caught herself thinking, have been easier, and even in its low, steady way happier, for happiness, she had learned, was not the same thing as love, and might even be its opposite. The great loves were mostly great sufferings, and the placid affections that no one wrote poems about were mostly where the actual daily contentment of human beings was to be found. She was ashamed of these thoughts. She loved Romeo. But she was 30 and tired, and she had married the most romantic man in the history of the world at the age of 14, and she had learned that romance is a terrible foundation for a marriage, that the very qualities that make a man climb an orchard wall at midnight to swear his love, the recklessness, the intensity, the willingness to stake everything on a feeling, are the same qualities that make him a difficult husband, a poor provider, a man of storms, and that the good husband, the husband you actually want to grow old with, is often precisely the man who would never have climbed the wall, the sensible man, the Paris, the man of no poetry and much reliability. She had chosen the wall climber. She had chosen him at 14 in 3 days on a balcony, drunk on moonlight, and she had gotten exactly what such a choice earns. A lifetime with a wall climber, which is a lifetime of a certain kind of glory and a certain kind of hell, and no possibility ever of the low, steady happiness she now sometimes, guiltily, wondered about. And Romeo, for his part, Romeo had his own version of these thoughts and his own shame at them. He watched Juliet grow tired and thickened and short-tempered and buried in the children, and he mourned in secret the girl at the window, and he too found himself imagining, not other women exactly, but other lives, the life he might have had if he had not climbed the wall, if he had gotten over Juliet as he had gotten over Rosaline, if he had stayed a Montague, married some suitable Montague-approved girl, inherited his father's wealth. and lived out an ordinary rich man's life in Verona with an ordinary wife he loved ordinarily and never once thought of throwing his life away for. He too had chosen, at 17 in 3 days, and he too had gotten exactly what the choice earns, and he too sometimes lay awake and wondered what the other life would have been, and hated himself for wondering because he did love her. He had always loved her. That was never the question. That was the strange thing they both slowly discovered over the long years, that the love was never the question. The love survived everything, the poverty, the quarrels, the exhaustion, the tempting idea of Paris, the mourning for their younger selves, all of it. The love was still there, low and red under the ash, real, unkillable. But the love being there was not the same as the love being what it had been, and the gap between the love they had and the love they remembered was where all the sorrow lived. They had not fallen out of love. They had fallen out of the legend, which is a different and quieter and lonelier thing, and there is no cure for it, and no one to tell, because who would believe that Romeo and Juliet, of all people, spent their long marriage grieving the loss of Romeo and Juliet? Chapter 5: The Feud Unhealed. There was one more loss, and it was the largest, and it was the one that no one, not Romeo, not Juliet, not Friar Lawrence, not the world had seen coming, because it was invisible, because it was the loss of a thing that had never happened. In the old story, the story where they die, the deaths of Romeo and Juliet accomplish the one thing that all their living love could never have accomplished. They end the feud. The two fathers, standing over the bodies of their children in the tomb, broken by grief, at last understand the monstrousness of the hatred that has killed the only good thing either house had produced, and they clasp hands over the corpses and swear to raise golden statues to each other's dead children, and the ancient grudge dies with the young lovers, so that their deaths are not merely a private tragedy but a public redemption, the sacrifice that heals the city. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. Woe, yes, but woe that meant something. Woe that bought the peace of Verona. 2 children dead, but a feud ended, a city healed, 1,000 future deaths prevented. Their love, which could do nothing while they lived, did everything by their dying. But they did not die, and so the feud did not end. This is the cruelest of all the ironies, and it took Romeo and Juliet many years to understand it, and when they understood it, it was the bitterest understanding of their lives. By living, they had saved themselves and doomed Verona to go on bleeding. The Montagues and the Capulets, deprived of the shocking sacrifice that would have shamed them into peace, simply went on hating each other, year after year, decade after decade. There were more brawls in the marketplace. There were more young men killed over insults no one could name. Tybalt was already dead, killed by Romeo before the flight. But there were other Tybalts, other Mercutios, cousins and friends and hot young men on both sides, and they went on dying, 1 and 2 at a time, over the years, because the old grudge had never been given the one thing that could kill it, which was a grief too large to survive. Romeo and Juliet, safe in their distant town under their false name, heard the news from Verona as travelers brought it over the years. Another Montague dead, another Capulet, another brawl, another mother weeping in another great house. And they understood slowly what their survival had cost not them but everyone else. Had they died in the tomb as they were meant to, their 2 deaths would have ended the feud and saved all those other lives. By living, they had let all those other people die. Their happiness, such as it was, the low-banked happiness of their imperfect marriage, had been purchased, without their knowing it at the time, with the lives of strangers, the young men of Verona who went on killing each other for want of the one sacrifice that would have stopped them. "We should have died," Juliet said one night aloud at last, the thought that had been unspoken between them for 20 years, when the news came that a boy of the Capulets, a cousin's son, a child she had held as a baby before her flight, had been killed in the street by a Montague over nothing, over an old grudge that her own death might have ended. "We should have died in the tomb, Romeo. If we had died, they would all still be alive. All of them. Every one of the boys who's died since." Our fathers would have clasped hands over us and ended it, and Verona would have had peace, and all those mothers would still have their sons. We chose to live, and all of them died for it. Our whole happiness is built on their graves. Was it worth it? Was our life, this ordinary, tired, quarreling life, was it worth all of theirs? And Romeo had no answer, because there was no answer, because the arithmetic was monstrous and undeniable. Their 2 lives, saved, against the dozen lives lost in the feud that their deaths would have ended. By any accounting, they should have died. Their survival was, in the great ledger of Verona, a catastrophe, a dozen deaths where there should have been 2, a feud prolonged for decades where it should have ended in a day, also that 2 people could live out an ordinary marriage in a distant town under a false name, grieving their lost youth and quarreling about money. The most famous love in the world, which in dying redeemed a city, in living damned it. Chapter 6. The Friar's Confession. Friar Lawrence, very old now, came to visit them once, near the end of his life. He had never stopped feeling responsible. He had married them. He had given Juliet the potion. He had devised the whole desperate plan, and though in this telling the plan had worked and they had lived, he had lived long enough to see what the living cost, and it weighed on him. He sat with them in their small house, an old man among the middle-aged couple and their nearly grown children, and he said what he had come to say. "I have thought about it all my life," he said. "I married you hoping to end the feud. I told you so at the time, do you remember? For this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love. That was my hope, that your love, joined and blessed, would shame the 2 houses into peace. And it did not. Your love, while it lived openly, did nothing. It only made things worse. It got Tybalt killed and Romeo banished, and the feud hotter than ever. And then when the plan seemed to fail, when you seemed to die, I have wondered, God forgive me, whether your deaths would not have done what your love could not, whether I did wrong to save you, whether the letter reaching Mantua, the thing I prayed for, was the answer to my prayer or the frustrating of a greater plan than mine. For your deaths would have ended it. Your living did not. I saved 2 children and lost a city. Is that a good priest's work? I have never known. I am dying and I still do not know." And Juliet, who had thought this same thought for 20 years, said, "Then you feel it too, that we should have died?" "No," said the old friar, and here he surprised them, for they had expected him to agree, to confirm the arithmetic, to say yes, the city would have been better served by your graves. "No, that is not what I feel. I feel the weight of it, the boys who died, the feud that went on, all of it. I feel it, and I will carry it to my own grave. But I do not believe you should have died. I have come, at the very end, to believe the opposite, and I have come a long way to tell you so, because I think you have both spent your lives believing the wrong thing, and I would not have you believe it to your graves as I nearly did." He leaned forward, the old hands trembling. "You think," he said, "that the love you had at 17 and 14, the balcony, the 3 days, the flame, was the real thing, and that everything since has been a falling off, a lesser thing, an ordinary marriage grieving a lost legend. You think you should have died at the height of it, because that was the true Romeo and Juliet, and this tired, quarreling couple is only its ruin. That is what you believe, and I have come to tell you it is exactly backwards. That flame you had for 3 days, it was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw, and it was also nothing. It was easy. Any 2 children drunk on moonlight can burn like that for 3 days. It costs nothing to love perfectly for 3 days when you have never had to see each other tired or poor or afraid or wrong. That love was a gift, not an achievement. You did not build it, it fell on you like weather. And if you had died in it, you would have died having never actually loved each other at all, only the idea of each other, the torchlit transfigured other, the shrine and the pilgrim. You would have been a perfect legend and an empty one, 2 children who died for a feeling 3 days old. But this," he gestured around the small house, at the worn furniture and the grown children and the 2 tired middle-aged people who had once been the most romantic lovers in the world, "this is the achievement. This is the real thing, the thing the legend never got to become. You have seen each other now. You have seen each other tired and poor and afraid and cruel and wrong. You have said the terrible things and slammed the doors and lain awake back to back, and you are still here, still married, still under all the ash and love. Do you understand what that is? That is love. Not the flame is easy. The banked coal that survives 20 winters of ordinary life, that is the hard and holy thing, and almost no one in the history of the world has ever managed it. And you too, who the world thinks died as children in a tomb, you actually did it. You are not the ruin of Romeo and Juliet. You are the only Romeo and Juliet who ever grew up. You are what the legend would have wanted to become if legends could want anything. Do not grieve the flame. The flame was your childhood. This weary, faithful, low red glow under 20 years of ash. This is your greatness, and no one will ever write a poem about it, and that is exactly why it is greater than the poem. Chapter 7: The Long Marriage. The old friar died soon after and left them with his words, and they did not believe him at first. It is hard to believe that the tired thing you have is greater than the shining thing you lost. But the words worked in them, slowly, over the years that followed, the way true things work in people, not all at once but by a gradual settling, until one day you find you have come to believe what you could not believe when you were told it. They grew old together. This is the thing the tragedy never lets its lovers do, and it is the thing this telling exists to give them. They grew old. The children grew up and married and had children of their own, and Romeo and Juliet became grandparents, and the small house that had once been full of crying babies grew quiet again, and the two of them who had married as children and quarreled through their middle years found in their old age a peace they had never had. For the quarrels burned themselves out, in time, the way quarrels do when there is no longer the energy or the stake for them. The money troubles eased. Romeo's work, which he had done badly and resentfully for so long, he came at last to do well and even to take a quiet pride in, and there was enough, and the fear of not enough that had poisoned so many of their years lifted. The black moods that had made Romeo so difficult softened with age into something gentler, a melancholy that no longer frightened anyone, that Juliet had long since learned to weather. And Juliet, freed of the children, freed of the fear, freed of the exhaustion, found her way back, not to the girl on the balcony. That girl was gone forever, and she no longer wanted her back. But to something the girl on the balcony had never had, which was the deep-settled companionship of a person who has been known entirely for 50 years, and is loved not despite the knowing but through it. They talked in their old age more than they had ever talked in their youth. The lovers of the balcony had not really talked at all. They had made speeches at each other, beautiful speeches, sonnets, vows, but not the low, ordinary talk of two people who know each other to the bone. Now they talked all the time, easily, about nothing, about everything, in the shorthand of a marriage that has lasted, finishing each other's thoughts, sitting in silences that were not the tense silences of the quarreling years, but the deep, comfortable silences of two people who no longer need to fill the air, because they are entirely at home in each other's presence. This, Juliet thought, was the thing no one told you about, the thing the poems left out because you cannot rhyme it, that the great reward of a long marriage is not passion, which fades, and is not even happiness exactly, but company, the simple, enormous, unglamorous gift of not being alone, of having one other person in the world who has seen the whole of your life and stayed, who knew you young and knows you old and holds both in the same steady gaze. She thought about Paris, sometimes, still, the sensible match she had not made, the easy life she had wondered about. And she understood now that she had wondered about the wrong thing. The question had never been whether the calm life with Paris would have been happier than the stormy life with Romeo. The question was whether she would have ended up, at 80, sitting in a quiet room in a deep and easy silence with a person who had known her for 60 years and loved her through all of it. And with Paris, she thought, perhaps she would have, for Paris was a good man and might have given her exactly that. The steady life was not the wrong life, but it was not a better life than the one she had. It was only a different road to the same place, and she had taken the harder road, the road through the fire and the poverty and the quarrels and the grief. And it had brought her in the end to the same quiet room, the same deep silence, the same old hand in hers, and there was no way to know, and no longer any need to know, whether the other road would have brought her somewhere better, because she was here in this room with this man, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 8, the story no one tells. Romeo died first, an old man in his bed with Juliet beside him, not with poison in a tomb at 17, but at 70-some, gently, of the ordinary wearing out of an ordinary long life, holding the hand of the wife he had been married to for more than 50 years. And his last words were not a suicide speech over a beloved supposed corpse. No, thus with a kiss I die. None of the terrible, beautiful poetry of the tomb. His last words were ordinary, domestic, almost nothing. He asked whether she was warm enough, whether she had eaten, small, tired, tender words of a man who had spent 50 years learning to love not with speeches, but with the low, steady attention that is love's grown-up form. And then he was gone, quietly, and Juliet held his hand as it cooled, and she did not take his dagger and follow him because she was old, and there were children and grandchildren who needed her, and because she understood now, as the old friar had tried to tell her long ago, that the dagger was the easy thing, the flame was the easy thing, and the hard and holy thing was to go on, to live out the rest of her days carrying him inside her. To be the keeper of a 50-year marriage that no poem would ever celebrate. She lived a few years more, and she thought often in that time about the two versions of herself. The girl who had died in the tomb at 14, in the story the world tells, and the old woman she had become, in the story no one tells. And she came to a strange peace about it, a peace that she could never have explained to the girl on the balcony, who would have found it incomprehensible, even repugnant. The girl in the tomb was immortal. That was true. She and her Romeo, dead at the height of love, had become the most famous lovers in the history of the world, wept over for 1,000 years, the very definition of love itself, golden statues in the heart of every person who ever loved and lost. That girl would never grow old, never grow tired, never quarrel, never see her husband come home gray with fatigue, never wonder about Paris, never bury a child, never grieve the loss of her own younger self, because she had been frozen perfect at the summit forever. The world would always love her. The world would never love the old woman by the fire, who no one had ever heard of, whose 50-year marriage was known to no poet and mourned by no city and celebrated in no story. And yet this was the peace she came to, the third thing past both the legend and the grief she would not trade. She would not be the girl in the tomb. She had thought for most of her life that she should have died there, that the legend was the real thing and her long life the falling off. But at the very end she understood that it was the opposite, exactly as the friar had said. The girl in the tomb had loved for 3 days and died. She, the old woman by the fire, had loved for 50 years and grown old. The girl in the tomb had a perfect love that had never been tested by a single ordinary day. She had an imperfect love that had been tested by 20,000 ordinary days and had survived every one of them. The girl in the tomb was a beautiful idea. She was a true thing. And a true thing, she now believed with her whole worn heart, was worth more than the most beautiful idea in the world, was worth more precisely because it was not beautiful, because it was tired and flawed and hard-won and real, because it had cost everything and been paid for in full over half a century, while the idea had cost only 3 days and a little poison, and had bought immortality on the cheap. For never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo. That is the last line of the story the world tells, the story of the tomb, and it is a true line for that story. But the story no one tells, the story of the two who lived and grew old and quarreled and endured, and came at last to the quiet room and the deep silence and the old hand in the old hand. That story has a different last line, one that no one ever wrote because no one ever knew the story existed. And the last line of the story no one tells is not a line about woe at all. It is a line about the thing that is harder than woe and rarer than woe and greater than woe, the thing the tragic lovers never lived long enough to earn. It is a line about a love that did not die beautifully young but lived long and plainly and completely, all the way down to the ash in the last cooling hand, and was, in its unsung and unbeautiful and utterly ordinary faithfulness, the truest love story that was never told. Juliet died not long after Romeo, an old woman in the same bed, and if there was any justice in whatever comes after, she went not to the tomb of the legend but to wherever the long-married go, to the deep silence, the easy company, the old hand in hers, and found him there, not the boy from the balcony, whom she had long since stopped missing, but the man she had actually loved, the tired, faithful man of 50 years, waiting and asking. In the small, tender, ordinary words that were the real poetry of their real love, whether she was warm enough, whether she had eaten, whether she was, at last, home. The end.